to the PennyBlack Tattoo Knowledgebase. My apologies as usual for such a delay in updates, but perfection takes time. Today I would like to go over a subject that's actually one suggested by a viewer, and that is styles. Often people will come into the studio looking for a tattoo. They've got no real experience with the process of it at all. And they'll say to us, I'm looking to get a tattoo of an owl. And then we look at them and say, okay, what style do you want? And we get a blank look in response because they don't really understand the difference between American traditional, Japanese traditional, black and gray, realism, anything like that. So I thought today what I would like to do is go over some of the more common styles that are popular, some of the more common styles that are time tested and true, and give you a bit of an understanding of what differentiates each different style from one another. Now I would like to point out that when I discuss styles, I'm talking about style as opposed to technique. I don't plan on going into stick and poke versus thread versus tap versus tabori versus rotary versus coil, anything like that. Styles, not technique. With this as well, I plan on including some visual reference. And with the visual reference, I will also include the Instagram accounts of the artists I've chosen. And I would like to point out that I don't mean this to be, these are the very best of the best. In all honesty, I've just chosen artists that I like or that I know personally. I'm not trying to start any kind of war as to who's good, who's bad, or anything like that. So, without further ado, let's begin. And we will start with American traditional. Now you will know this primarily as the style popularized by Sailor Jerry. Yes, he was an actual artist and it's not just rum. Now the style itself was born of Cap Coleman and it was codified by the likes of Bert Grimm and Lyle Tuttle and Owen Jensen, but really it was perfected by Sailor Jerry. Now the style itself is basically bold, clean lines, heavy black shading, and very, very bold color work with an underlying sense of folk art primitivism. The truth of the matter is that especially prior to Jerry, a lot of the artists that were doing this style weren't very gifted artists, and that showed in the designs and how they were executing them. Over time, that gelled together into the style itself. But in order to truly be American traditional, there needs to be a certain kind of simplistic, basic folk art aspect to it. But bright, bright colors, basic colors, and super bold black, that's American traditional. After that, I'm going to talk about Japanese traditional. Now this is actually somewhat out of order because of the truth of the matter is Japanese traditional is fundamentally what spawned American traditional. The Japanese traditional has some extremely specific rules, and it's one of the reasons I love this style so much is that if you follow those rules, you're going to get a great tattoo. Again, very clean, bold lines, very, very bold, strong shading, very, very elegant shapes that conform to the human body, and the illusion of extreme detail through repetitious patterns. So for example, scales on dragons or feathers on phoenix, things like that. Japanese traditional also very heavily leans towards specific motifs like dragons, like koi, like tigers, like famous wrestlers or warriors, gods, things that are very specific to Japan's culture. Those things together give you Japanese traditional. It's an extremely time-honored, hallowed kind of style, and realistically, pretty much all American traditional is descended from Japanese traditional. They follow the same patterns and paths. Follow the rules for both, you're going to get a good tattoo no matter what. After that, there's neo or post-traditional. Now this is going to be extremely difficult for the average layperson to differentiate between true American traditional. One is really a descendant of the other. So neo-traditional follows a lot of the same patterns as American traditional, but neo-traditional tends to be executed with a much more refined illustrative sense. So where true American traditional has that folk primitivism, neo-traditional takes the same designs and same ideas and then ups the ante of skill and ability immeasurably so. You can see in the examples I'm showing on screen with Teresa Sharp or with Richard Shaw, Broken Puppet, the designs they're doing may look old school, but if you really pay attention to the way they use color, really pay attention to the way they use S-curve shapes and forms, it's not truly old school. It's an evolution of old school. It's extremely, extremely beautiful, well executed neo-traditional is gorgeous. And if anything, it borrows even more heavily from Japanese traditional in that it pays greater attention to how the images and forms and shapes adhere to the human body and accent the human body and the form and shape of it. American traditional didn't do this as much. Neo-traditional definitely does. Closely related to neo-traditional, you have New School, which for the longest time has been N-U-S-K-O-O-L. New School and Neo-traditional are fairly similar, except for that New School ups the ante of color even more so. So New School is defined by its ultra vibrant, powerful, bright colors. It also is heavily defined by its extreme use of perspective and cartoon shapes. It's a gorgeous style, but it isn't really for everybody. The work that Dave Tevenall does, the work that Kelly Doty does, it's amongst my favorite in all tattooing, but not everybody is as into the really exaggerated cartoon effects that they produce, but it's still worth knowing the difference between neo-traditional and New School. They're very closely related, but New School has to have that extremely exaggerated perspective and cartoony aspect to it to make it New School. Next up we have Tribal. Now this is a pretty deep one because Tribal branches out like no other style you're going to find. When you think of Tribal, you are most likely thinking of Zulueta style Tribal. We call it that because it was introduced to North America by Leo Zulueta. Prior to Leo's work, nobody in North America was getting tribal tattooing. He came along and introduced a modified version of Borneo tribal. Now when you think of the 90s tribal armband, that's Zulueta tribal. That style of tribal isn't as common as it used to be. It still potentially can look really awesome, but as you can see from the images on the screen here, it's not particularly elaborate, it's not particularly complex. As you'll be able to see when we get to the Borneo examples, the 1, 2, 3 connection between the two is obvious. Leo was just repackaging Borneo tribal for a North American market, and he is still the motherfucking man. Leo's awesome. Other tribal that you may think of when the word tribal comes to mind would be Polynesian tribal. Now this is another one that has underneath its umbrella multiple branching things. And we're not going to get into the specific differences between Hawaiian Polynesian, Fijian Polynesian, Maori Polynesian, and Moko, etc. We're just going to use the umbrella term Polynesian. Polynesian tribal is defined by its extremely detailed ribbons and patterns. Each of those different designs and patterns has a meaning to it. So in order to get proper, true Polynesian tribal, you need to have an artist that understands the meaning of those things and respects the culture it comes from. I'm not generally hugely into the idea of cultural appropriation, but in this particular instance, it's a style that demands respect. If you're going to get Polynesian tribal, make sure it's from somebody who knows what it means and that you're not just biting on something you think looks neat. But like Japanese work, Polynesian tribal is also really heavily rooted in understanding the form and flow of the human body and how those patterns and shapes can make it look amazing. The examples I'm showing here with Bong Tatao, he's a master of this work, and you can see it in the way that his work forms and flows over the musculature and enhances the shapes. Polynesian looks mint. Now we get to what is truly Borneo tribal. Mostly when you think of Borneo tribal, if you think of Borneo tribal, you're going to be thinking of either the Borneo rose or the Borneo scorpion. Those are the two designs that were the most common and popular for that form. Now the Borneo scorpion, in this case, Leo that I showed you a little bit back, he had a Borneo scorpion as part of his work. That particular motif is actually meant for women to have on their hands as a magic protector against anything that might get into what they were doing. It was actually part of their headhunter culture. So it has a lot of meaning and a lot of depth to it. Most Borneo tribal does. But the reason that I specifically point out Borneo tribal is, again, because everything we understand tribal to be in North America was born of Borneo tribal. So it's worth mentioning specifically it as its own thing. Now after that we have coastal native tribal. Now this is probably the least understood or the least known form of tribal tattooing, and it's basically tattoos that are all patterned after Haida, Coast Salish, or Tlingit designs, coastal North American native tattoo designs. Now this one is very difficult to actually execute, because while it seems like very basic shapes and blacks and reds, it's actually a lot more precise than it might seem. So as a tattoo artist trying to do it, it's very difficult to do really well. The examples that I'm showing with Dino, as far as I'm concerned, Dino is kind of the man. He is about the best there is for this style of tribal tattooing. There isn't quite as much deep meaning to coastal native cultural work, but there is still some, and again, it behooves you to find out if you're going to get that kind of work, find an artist who understands it and is going to respect the work. So those would be your kind of traditional tribal styles. But now we have new styles that are somewhat stylistically similar, sort of descendants of those styles. So the first of which would be mandala tattooing. So even though the mandala has got nothing to do with tribal as we understand it, mandala tattooing is still fundamentally an offshoot of tribal tattooing. So mandala tattoos are basically repeating pattern floral designs. They're usually circles or semicircles, and each layer of the circle as it expands outwards is a different pattern. And they, more often than not, those patterns look like flowers. You see them quite often done as sort of sternum half pieces done on women. Very, very nice. But the mandala is a style that has proven itself over centuries to be classic and timeless, and I think it's one that's going to stick with us a lot longer than Zulueta style tribal did. After that, we would have what has come to be known as sacred geometry, which really is stylistically very, very similar to mandala, but sacred geometry will include basic geometric shapes. So a lot of dots in sort of line forms with triangles, rectangles, you know, all kinds of different geometric cube shapes. You usually see sacred geometry and mandala work done together, but they are distinctly separate things. And the example that I'm showing you of sacred geometry, the sort of god of that style, Thomas, you'll see that his work is extremely bold and it's massive. And again, it's all about geometric shapes used in hugely powerful patterns that give you lots of impact. And then the final sort of offshoot to all of this that again is very similarly related, and you see it sort of blended in often with these other styles, Mendi and sacred geometry, would be Mendi, or sort of bridal Mendi designs taken from India. Usually, again, you don't see them on their own, and it's very rare to see bridal Mendi done in true Mendi fashion, which is to say on the hands. Usually that's still just henna done for weddings. But the design motifs of Mendi, the very S-curve, pretty floral shapes, again with the sort of base folk crudity, that's what defines Mendi. And it is an exceptionally beautiful form to mix in with sacred geometry and mandala work, and it is really, really elegant and really, really pretty. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about black and gray realism. So black and gray realism is usually what you think of when you think of portraiture, but it doesn't always have to be portraits. As long as it's realistic, that's black and gray realism. So it can be a realistic portrait style tattoo of a human, it can be a realistic portrait style tattoo of an animal, it can be a realistic portrait style tattoo of a house. As long as it looks fundamentally realistic and done in black and gray, that's black and gray realism. So the examples I'm showing you here, Bob Terrell's work, one of those examples is of a Nosferatu. Obviously not a real thing, but the way Bob has done the tattoo is still very realistic looking. That is black and gray realism. Whether it's a real thing or not, the underlying thing that makes it a piece of black and gray realism is whether the attempt was made to make it look like a real thing on the skin. It's honestly a spectacular style, pioneered heavily by the southern sort of LA Cholo gangsters. They've done some spectacular work with single needle black and gray portraiture. But that style is one of the most common you're going to find through any tattoo studio anywhere in the world. Realism is the bomb. Compare that to color realism, which is much harder to do. At the same time, the same rule applies. Color realism doesn't automatically have to mean portrait. It just has to mean that you have attempted to make a tattoo look real using color. Very, very hard to do. Usually works best with floral, but the true masters of color realism don't always have to be doing pictures of flowers. It just helps if they do. Now we're going to start moving into some of the newer fine art styles of tattooing. Some of these are pretty intense. We're going to start with trash polka. Now trash polka is interesting because I think it's probably the most aped style of tattooing. That is to say, the style of tattooing that more artists think they can do than any other style, and frankly almost none of them can. Trash polka was effectively pioneered by two artists in particular. These artists are the ones I'm showing you as examples right now. But if you just search trash polka tattoo on Google, you will see hundreds upon hundreds of attempts at copying this style, and they've pretty much all failed. Trash polka is a very, very interesting blend of extremely black illustrative graphic design with splashes of deep red crimson. It's a very, very messy style, but it's one that requires an extremely skilled hand to pull off properly. Anybody thinks they can just slap some black slashes here and there, throw a skull in there, and maybe a few dots and call it trash polka. But I assure you, it does not work unless you're extremely gifted at doing this style. From there we have what you would call deconstructionist tattooing. I personally think deconstructionist tattooing looks amazing. Deconstructionist is fundamentally taking illustrations and deconstructing them, breaking them down into their most basic shape. And so the examples I'm showing you right now with Mambo Tattooer, he is, as far as I'm concerned, the god of this style of tattooing. He can take a design, an idea, and render it down into almost 2 lines and still convey what it's supposed to be. Beautiful, really interesting, really bold and striking, but like trash polka, very difficult to do. Minimalism is always harder than people think it is. Great style though. Next we would have abstract. So abstract is a bit difficult to pin down or define as a style because it's abstract. It fundamentally lends itself to being kind of anything and nothing. Abstract is one of those things where you just sort of need to develop a bit of an understanding for what it is when you see it. It's hard to say, well, abstract is this, this, and this. That makes it abstract. I've shown you examples of an artist that I've been fortunate enough to get work from, Leonardo Bori, who I believe is an exceptional example of abstract tattooing. He has this very different approach to applying images to skin that is somewhat deconstructed, but somewhat fine art, and also somewhat traditional abstract in that he's got a little bit of Picasso in his flavor and style as well. Abstract is a style that's coming to be more and more common, more and more popular, more and more genre boundary pushing, but it's one to keep an eye open for because you can get some cool looking stuff out of abstract tattooing. You may also sort of say that the next style isn't really a style as such as another form of abstract, and you could be right, but contemporary fine art tattooing I think is somewhat different from pure abstract in that contemporary fine art will employ aspects of abstract, it will employ aspects of deconstructionism, but it will also employ aspects of color realism, and it blends them all in a very interesting way that is somewhat strange and somewhat real, all in equal measure. So the artist that I'm showing you by way of example is very good at this, to the point where she's about the only artist, I believe, that's ever been recognized as a contemporary fine artist by a Roman museum. What that means, I don't know, but hey, at least she can say it. Then you have fine line illustrative. And this will be another style that you may look at and think, well, that's just deconstructionist. But that's not entirely true. Fine line illustrative will employ some of the simplified concepts and ideas of deconstructionist, but fine line illustrative can also be extremely detailed. The only real underlying element of fine line illustrative is that it literally looks like it was drawn on with a pen, and it's very fine line and detailed. As a style, it's a bit questionable for me as an old school style artist because I look at fine line illustrative and I question and wonder how well it's going to age. Time will tell. I think the really skilled fine line artists are able to do that style and keep it looking proper in the skin over years and years. But a lot of people who are trying it, it's not going to age very well at all. As a direct descendant of fine line illustrative, you have what we would call woodcut or scrimshaw. Now, the prime difference between fine line illustrative and woodcut or scrimshaw is that fine line illustrative can be done with some shading and still be fine line illustrative. Woodcut scrimshaw has to be lines only. It's the cross-hatching and line work that makes the shading, and that defines woodcut scrimshaw. So really, scrimshaw is just what old sailors used to do on ivory. In long voyages, they would take a whale tooth and carve out designs on these teeth, usually of nudes and mermaids and women, you know, this is what's on their mind. But again, because you can't really shade in a piece of ivory, you would just use the lines to indicate your lowlights, highlights, things like that. That's scrimshaw. Realistically though, scrimshaw is just a variation on the patterns and shapes and designs that defined woodcut art. So woodcut, scrimshaw, they're pretty interchangeable. If you Google either one, you're going to find designs that are fairly similar. In tattoo terms though, what specifically defines that as a style aside from fine line illustrative is that, again, cross-hatching and fine line shading as opposed to actual shading techniques. It can look really cool, but there's not too many artists that are killing it these days. Sam Rules is honestly the best example of it, I think. The next style I'm going to touch on very, very quickly is brutal black work. I'm fairly torn as to whether I think this is a laughable joke or a viable, interesting sort of milestone in new tattooing. Brutal black work is effectively massive swaths of the human canvas savagely tattooed with black. It doesn't always have to be just a great big chunk of black. A blacked out arm isn't the only thing that defines brutal black work. In a lot of cases, you'll find that brutal black work is done with a really, really heavy, brush strokey sort of savage line work look to it. So I'm including images from Lefty Tombu, who is a very, very gifted brutal black work artist. He's actually somebody who used to work with me. And you can see in his designs, they're not always just huge chunks of black skin, but generally speaking, to make it brutal black work, you have to have a very, very significant component of human skin savagely blacked out. That's what makes it brutal black work. Now we're going to touch on watercolor. Watercolor tattooing is one of the most popular tattoo styles out there right now, and watercolor tattooing shares a lot in common with trash polka in that, like trash polka, there's an awful lot of artists who think they know how to do watercolor tattooing. There's more to doing a watercolor tattoo than just scribbling some colors behind a line work image. A true watercolor tattoo master is going to have a very, very strong understanding of the color wheel. They're going to have a great understanding of color tonality, of getting different hues and shades and tones and tints out of a single color, not just going scribble, scribble, scribble and calling it a day. Really good watercolor tattooing is going to be rooted in extremely strong, bold colors and blacks in order to preserve the contrast and keep the color alive. A watercolor artist who doesn't really understand these fundamentals is just going to put whatever little swaths of yellow they want and then wonder why the tattoo is completely faded away and looks terrible in a year's time. Watercolor, when executed properly, can look really, really good, as evidenced by the examples I'm showing you of Phil Kwan. His work is spectacular. But always remember that good watercolor is not simply smeared colors behind a line work piece. There's a lot more to it. So do your homework. Finally, we're going to touch on micro tattoos. These are probably my least favorite style of tattoo. They're very common in Korea right now. They're growing in popularity in North America, and they're extremely frustrating because they are absolutely executed without any care or concern for longevity whatsoever. These are tattoos that are aiming for extreme realism in as small an area as possible using a single needle and no bold colors at all. They don't really use true black for this sort of thing because in order to use true black for this sort of tattooing, it would ruin the effect. These tattoos are completely done with nothing more than the fresh photo in mind. You don't ever see examples of micro tattooing that is healed with 6 months time behind it, because if you did, people would see how horrible they look over time. Now I know that a lot of new artists coming into the industry really would rather not listen to crusty old dinosaurs like myself. They certainly don't want to hear things like bold will hold even when you're old. And so they're so willing to do these exceptionally delicate, tiny, tiny little tattoos with single needle just gently, lightly brushed into the skin. But the truth of the matter is that these tattoos aren't going to stay in the skin for any length of time. And so they've got an exceptionally high regret factor. So many people who get micro tattoos are not going to be happy with these tattoos over 5, 10, 15 years. And so for me, it's an extremely frustrating style to witness as it grows in popularity. What defines a micro tattoo is, as I said, it has to be extremely tiny and you're aiming for a type of realism. So if you search micro tattoo, you're likely going to see a lot of portraits of cats, portraits of dogs. For some reason, running shoes are a very common motif. Why, I don't know. But also be careful if you are interested in this style and you do want to look it up. Beware that micro tattooing is one of the worst forms for cheating. Most of the tattoos you see posted on Instagram or any other source of micro tattoos has likely been photoshopped very, very heavily. So make sure to zoom right in there and pay attention for signs of overlaid images. In a lot of cases, these cheaters are taking their tattoos and laying the reference image over top and then blending them so they look like a singular image. So generally speaking, if you see a micro tattoo that literally looks like an object sitting on skin, pretty good chance that's been a fake tattoo. But micro tattoos are tiny single needle pieces. So there are multiple subgenres, if you will, for any of these. I'm not trying to say that this is the definitive, exhaustive, these are the only styles out there. You can really argue terminology till the cows come home. There's all sorts of different ways to approach and think about styles of tattooing. In this case, I hope that this guide has given you at least a semi-solid understanding of what each different type of tattooing can be, so that if you do go into a studio and they ask you, what style do you want this? At the very least, you should now be able to say, I want my owl done in black and gray realism. Then the artist knows exactly what you want, and you can proceed from there. As always, I hope it helped, and we'll see you next time.
Fall to your knees, motherfucker, 'cause the devil gonna make you pay. Motherfucker is on his way.